"If you're gonna steal the catalytics off my truck." It was supposed to be an ordinary morning, but that changed in an instant. The events that unfolded at the beginning of last week began with a rude awakening at precisely 2:45 am. The sudden roar of my truck's engine reverberated through the neighborhood, an obnoxious noise that broke the calm of the early hours. But it wasn't because I had just started it. It was because when I turned the key and cranked the engine it sounded off. The deep rumble that usually announced my truck's presence had been replaced by a sickening, hollow echo, something that sent a shiver down my spine. I quickly realized that I'd been a victim of one of the most common types of theft in recent years, catalytic converter theft. It seemed like every other day there was a story on the news about someone's catalytic. Yet there it was, the unmistakable sound of a truck without its catalytic converters, loud and obnoxious as it scraped the neighborhood awake. As the neighborhood stirred and people began to come outside to investigate the commotion, it quickly became clear that someone had taken my truck's catalytic converters, leaving behind the mess of damaged pipes and exposed wiring. It wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a costly repair job that I knew would take weeks to fix. But what really got under my skin was the fact that whoever did this didn't even have the decency to leave anything useful behind. They'd ripped out the hollowed-out catalytic. Still, there was an ironic twist. The thieves hadn't even bothered to check if the converters were functional before taking them. It seemed like they had taken my truck's parts without any real plan, and in the end it turned into nothing but a big joke. It was the sound of laughter that followed. I knew the culprits immediately. It wasn't difficult to figure out who the thieves were. The two kids who lived in the area, always driving around in their beat-up police-issued Crown Victoria. They were regulars at the local chicken shack, where they spent their days smoking cigarettes and causing trouble. And while they didn't seem to have a lot going for them, I knew exactly what they were doing when I saw their car parked near my street late at night. They were hunting for cars to strip of their catalytic converters. This wasn't the first time they'd done something like this, but it was definitely the most brazen. Rather than going through the usual routine of calling the police, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I wasn't going to let these punks get away with it this time. I called up a friend of mine who worked in code enforcement. He was a reliable guy, someone who knew the ins and outs of local law enforcement, and I figured he'd be a good ally in dealing with this situation. Once I explained what had happened, he gave me the green light to go ahead with a nuisance tow, essentially removing the Crown Victoria from the street. The car wasn't street legal anyway. It had no license plates, no insurance, and the taillights were busted, not to mention the engine rattled like it was being held together by duct tape and chewing gum. But, of course, these two idiots didn't seem to care. They didn't need a car that worked. They just needed something that could pass as a vehicle while they went about their petty criminal business. And that's exactly what they were doing, running around trying to make a quick buck by stealing parts from unsuspecting people's cars. When I saw that old Crown Vic parked on a quiet side street just a few days later, I knew this was my chance. I called it in, and soon enough my friend had coordinated with the police to allow me to tow it away. It was a small act of revenge, but I knew it would hit them hard. I had the car hauled to a junkyard, and when the police tried to run a VIN check, they discovered something surprising. The car hadn't been registered since 2011. The owners were nowhere to be found. Apparently, the kids had bought the car from someone who didn't have the title, likely to avoid paying the back registration fees. It was a small win, but it felt good to know the car had been removed from circulation. The junkyard was instructed to destroy the car, and once the police confirmed its status as unregistered, they issued a black title for it, essentially marking it for destruction. The best part of the whole ordeal came a few days later. I was sitting at home when I got wind of what was happening. Apparently, the two kids had realized their car was gone, and in true idiotic fashion, they assumed one of their friends had stolen it as some kind of prank. They didn't consider the possibility that it had been towed, let alone destroyed. They started running around town frantically searching for their vehicle, looking like a couple of fools. They eventually tracked the car down to the junkyard, where the owner had already been tipped off. They attempted to pull a classic bait and switch move, with one of them distracting the junkyard workers while the other tried to hotwire the car and drive it off. Unfortunately for them, the junkyard had already prepared for their arrival, and they were quick to take action. The workers, who had been warned ahead of time, had already disabled the car by cutting off its drive shift. It was a simple but effective move that ensured the car wouldn't be going anywhere. I wasn't there to see it firsthand, but from what I heard, it didn't take long for things to escalate. The two kids were caught trying to steal their own car back, and not only did they get arrested for their trouble. When I later saw what remained of the Crown Victoria, it looked like something out of a demolition derby, stripped down to the bare frame as if a toddler had gotten a hold of a toy and decided to destroy it out of curiosity. It was the perfect poetic end to their misguided attempt at criminality. As it turned out, the two kids were released from jail shortly after their arrest, but they never left their trailer. They seemed to have learned nothing from the experience, continuing to stay holed up in their rundown home. I did a quick drive by one afternoon, and that's when I noticed something that made me smile. In their driveway was a beater Jeep Liberty, sitting there with no license plates, the perfect target for another round of trouble. I knew that I'd be keeping an eye on it, and if it ever ventured into public, I'd be right there working with the police to get it towed, and hopefully crushed just like their precious Crown Vic. The idea of seeing their next car reduced to scrap was more than enough motivation to make sure I didn't miss the show. The days that followed were uneventful, at least for me. I kept my routine and tried not to get too involved in the chaos that those two troublemakers had stirred up. But every time I drove by their trailer, I couldn't help but keep an eye out for any signs of them being up to something new. They seemed like the kind of people who wouldn't learn from their mistakes, and sure enough, as the days passed, they proved me right. It was about a week later when I noticed something strange. I'd just come back from grabbing a coffee at the local shop when I drove past their trailer. It was mid-afternoon, and there wasn't much going on, just the usual quiet of the sleepy neighborhood. But then I saw it. The Jeep Liberty was gone. At first I thought I'd just missed it, but after looping around the block and checking again, it became clear the Jeep was missing, and I had a feeling it wasn't just a coincidence. I wasn't sure if it had been sold or if they had managed to get it roadworthy, but I knew one thing for sure: if it was back on the road, I had to act quickly. I wasn't about to let them get away with another car, especially not after what they'd tried to do to my truck. I immediately called my friend in code enforcement. He was always good to me, and I had a feeling he'd help again, even if it wasn't strictly within the law. The last thing I wanted was for these two kids to keep driving around and getting away with whatever they could steal or destroy next. We talked for a bit, and he told me to keep an eye out. The plan, as he laid it out, was to make sure the Jeep wasn't driven around without plates or insurance, a quick way to get it pulled over and towed. But it wasn't that simple. They were smart enough, or at least desperate enough, to avoid drawing attention to themselves. I was sure they knew I'd be watching, and if they had any sense left, they'd keep the Jeep off the road until they could figure out a way to cover up their tracks. But I couldn't wait. I wanted them caught. I wanted to make sure that they faced consequences for their actions, and if I could be the one to bring them to justice, I'd gladly do it. The next day, I was sitting at home when I got the call. My friend had some news. Apparently, the Jeep had been spotted again. This time it was cruising down Main Street, not far from the outskirts of town. It wasn't just a casual drive. It wasn't hard to figure out that it was the same old story. The kids were trying to make the Jeep look roadworthy while keeping it hidden, hoping that no one would take notice. I wasted no time. I jumped in my truck and headed to the area, keeping my distance while trying to stay out of sight. I didn't want them to spot me and take off. The streets were quieter than usual, with only a few cars passing by as I slowly drove along, watching every corner. Sure enough, I spotted the Jeep Liberty. It was parked in front of an old warehouse, looking abandoned, like it had been left there to gather dust. I couldn't believe it. They were already working to strip it down, and they hadn't even bothered to make sure it was out of sight. I called my friend again, giving him the location. Within minutes, I saw flashing lights in my rearview mirror, and a police car pulled up next to me. The officers got out, approached the Jeep, and immediately began checking the vehicle's registration status. I knew this wasn't going to end well for the kids, but I had no idea just how far things would go. The police quickly realized the Jeep wasn't just unregistered, it was actually stolen. It turned out that the two kids had somehow managed to get their hands on it, likely through some backdoor deal or through someone who didn't care about ownership. The officer ran a VIN check, and it came back as flagged, a vehicle with no plates, no insurance, and a questionable history. They took their time investigating, but I could see the look on their faces when they realized they'd just stumbled across another mess left behind by the same two idiots. The officers didn't waste any time. They arrested the two kids right there in front of the warehouse, pulling them out of the car one by one. They didn't even try to run. The desperation on their faces was enough to show they knew their time was up. As they were handcuffed and led to the police cars, they threw desperate glances toward the Jeep. But it was too late. The car was going to be towed, and their little plan to salvage it was officially over. I stayed around for a while, watching the whole scene unfold. It was oddly satisfying to see the Jeep. They had no idea that their time had run out. They thought they could get away with it, but they were wrong. What happened next was almost poetic. The officers inspected the warehouse, and it didn't take long before they found a stash of stolen parts, more catalytic converters, car batteries, and random vehicle parts hidden away behind piles of old junk. It was clear these kids had been running a small-time operation, stealing whatever they could get their hands on and trying to flip it for cash. They'd been operating under the radar, thinking they were untouchable. But the police had finally caught up with them. After the arrest, I drove by their trailer once again, feeling a sense of closure. The place was quiet, too quiet. I knew they were likely dealing with the fallout of their actions. Their criminal enterprise had crumbled, and it seemed like their lives were unraveling before their eyes. The Jeep was gone, their Crown Vic had already been destroyed, and now they had nothing to show for all their trouble. I felt a strange mix of satisfaction and pity. They'd dug their own graves, but I couldn't help but think that there was so much potential they'd wasted. Instead of doing something useful with their time, they'd chosen the path of petty theft and destruction. Now they'd have to face the consequences. It didn't take long before word got around. The whole town was buzzing about the arrests. It was the talk of the coffee shop, the post office, and even the local diner. People were glad that justice had finally been served, but for me it was more than just the satisfaction of seeing those kids get caught. It was about taking back what they'd stolen from me, making sure they couldn't keep